What's up, AP Psych? Welcome to our final video on Unit 4, Sensation and Perception. We wrapped up sensation. We talked about perceptual interpretation and how we understand perceptual information. Now we're going to talk about how we organize it to make even more sense of it as we go. So let's have our notes out and let's get started. To understand how perception is organized, illusions actually provide good examples. It's just as good to study faulty perception and how illusions can trick us as other perceptual phenomena because it can tell us a lot about how we perceive. So for example, here you have something called a molar liar illusion. And if you look at these two lines and I asked you which one was longer, based on your perception and the way the information is organized, you would probably say B and C, right? Because it looks that way, when in reality, they are the exact same length. Right? So that tells us a little bit about how our perception can change based on the way information is presented to us and how we can be tricked through that type of thing. Another example here, vertical dimensions of this arch, meaning the up and down, north and south here, look longer than the horizontal dimension, right? When in reality, both are equal because we view things higher in our visual field to be further away, right? And so we think this vertical length is longer than the horizontal when in reality they're both equal. Here's an example to show that, right? When you watch that spin, it ends up being the exact same length on the sides. Okay? So those are just a couple of illusions that tell us a little bit about our perception and how illusions can trick us based on the way that we organize information and what we expect to see in the environment. So when vision competes with other senses, vision usually wins. Right? This is a phenomenon called visual capture. So when we're taking in information from multiple senses, we tend to rely on our vision most because we think that's what we can trust. When we see it, we can believe it, right? That's that idea. That's called visual capture. Sometimes we over rely on our vision. How do we form meaningful perceptions from sensory organization? We organize it. Okay? We bring that information in through all of our senses, and we start to organize it in different areas to make sense of it. And that's perceptual organization. Okay? And a lot of times we do that through vision, but we can do that through other senses as well. To go along with perceptual organization, there's this idea of something called Gestalt psychology, which was put forth by a psychologist by the name of Max Wertheimer. You may remember him from Unit 1. But Gestalt psychology is all about how we organize information into meaningful wholes. Okay? So we can take different parts and pieces and put it together to get a larger picture. But what we are supposed to remember with Gestalt psychology is the whole is different from the sum of its parts. Right? So this is a little bit of both top-down processing and bottom-up. Okay? When we take the pieces and put them together, we're bottom-up processing. When we look at a whole and we expect to see certain things, right, we're top-down processing. So Max Wertheimer and Gestalt psychology would say it's a little bit of both when we organize our perceptions. First example of Gestalt psychology is something called figure ground. This is the organization of the visual field into objects, figures that stand out from their surroundings, the ground. Okay, so the images that are standing out from the background. Here's a couple of illusions that kind of emphasize this. Depending on what you're looking at first, over here, you might see the faces as the foreground, right? Those figures that stick out, and this white space as the background. Or if I point out to you that some people see this as a chalice or a cup or a candlestick, and they see the black area as the background. Okay? Determining what's the figure and what's the ground is important in our perception. Over here, some people see the arrows going up and down in the white space, and other people see seemingly humans running down a hill or going down steps with these legs and arms connected. So that's our concept of figure ground, determining what is actually the figures in the image and what's the background. Having discriminated figure from ground, telling the difference between the two, our perception needs to organize figures into meaningful forms using grouping rules. And in Gestalt psychology, there's a few grouping rules that we want to touch on. First being proximity, the way that these lines are organized. Just because each pair of two is closer together, we assume that they should be grouped that way, right? When in reality, these could just be 6 random lines, but we group them in our mind because of their proximity or their closeness to one another. Here, when you look at this, you're probably thinking, oh, there's 3 lines, a line of triangles, a line of circles, and a line of triangles. Because of their similarity to one another, we group them that way. Down here, we have something called continuity. When we have half circles that are connected, like here, just a half circle connected with another half circle, and so on. But for most of us, we see it as a straight line bisecting a squiggly line, right? And we do that because our brains want to see things that are connected, even though in reality, it could just be half circles that happen to be placed next to each other. And down here, we have something called connectedness. Our brain likes to make connections between things that it thinks should be connected, like these, what looks like barbells. But in reality, when you break it down to the fine pieces, it's just a circle, line, circle, circle, line, circle. But we like to put them together and show things as connected. So this is how our brain perceives and groups items once we've discriminated the figure from the ground. Here's another example. Usually, grouping principles help us construct reality, but at times they can lead us astray, right? That's just that top-down processing, our perceptual sets. We expect to see certain things, so we group those things together. And for most of the time, it's helpful, but sometimes it can be confusing for us. So here you have this man who built what looks like a little doghouse he's putting together. And look at these dogs. They're inside. He's working on building it. Looks pretty complete. He just needs to add the outer shell. When in reality, if you change the perception of it and you turn that doghouse, it's not near finished, right? Because of the way we were looking at it, our brain was closing in. This is a Gestalt psychology concept known as closure. It was closing in the gaps for us because of the way it was situated and turned. It looks like it's finished, but it's not, right? That's closure. We want to see things as finished or complete. Our brain wants to fill in that information. Think about our blind spot in our eye, right? Our brain fills in that information of where the blind spot is because it wants to have whole, complete pictures. Getting into depth perception, this is also a part of how we organize information, but depth perception enables us to judge distances, okay? Gibson and Walk, 2 psychologists in 1960, suggested that human infants around 6 months of age or crawling age have depth perception. Even newborn animals show depth perception. So this goes back to that idea of nature versus nurture. Are we born with perception or does it develop over time? They would ask babies to continue to crawl forward to something called the visual cliff experiment. And there's glass here, so they wouldn't actually fall. But they put the same color of tablecloth below the glass to see if the babies could tell that, oh, this is further away than that. I'm not going to crawl across there and fall, right? And by 6 months of age, all these babies were stopping. They were no longer crossing this visual cliff because they thought, I can't go any further. I know that this is further down than where I'm at now. So they had already developed some type of depth perception at such a young age. There are some cues that help us identify depth and how far away certain things are. The first cues we are going to talk about are called monocular cues. Mono meaning one, and ocular meaning eye, right? So these monocular cues, you use only one eye to perceive depth in these ways. The first one is something called interposition, and objects that occlude or block other objects tend to be perceived as closer, which makes sense, right? So in this instance, this is an illusion that messes with our idea of interposition because the horse and the rider and the trees are all intermixed with what's in front of the other. It doesn't make sense to our brain, and it doesn't make sense in general, right? We can't tell how far, what part of this object is further in depth than the other because the image is overlapping itself. But usually, interposition means that something that's in front of something else is closer to you. For example, when I put my hand over half my face, you can tell that my hand is closer to the camera because it's blocking part of my face, which is behind it. That's interposition. Another monocular cue that some artists may be familiar with is something called linear perspective. This is when parallel lines like railroad tracks or lines on the road appear to converge with distance. If you ever look down a long straight road, it'll look like it slowly comes closer together and eventually disappears in the distance. The more the lines converge, the greater the perceived distance. So we know way down here where it looks like the lines are super close together, we know that's really far down and has a lot of depth, right? We only need one eye to see linear perspective. Artists can use this to create 2D images that have depth in them. That's a linear perspective. Another monocular cue is relative size. If two objects are similar in size, we perceive one that casts a smaller retinal image as further away. Okay? All of these light posts, they are the exact same size, right? But we know which ones are further away because the image on our retina is getting smaller. Right? Even though we know they're the same size, we can tell distance because the image gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we go backwards on those light posts. That's relative size. Right? We perceive that one that casts a smaller retinal image as further away. Next up, we have relative height. We perceive objects higher in our visual field as further away. Okay? Because the higher you get in the visual field, the closer you are to the horizon. And we assume that things on the horizon are further from us than things not on the horizon, if that makes sense. So here you have these three men. They're all the same size, but because this guy is further or higher in our visual field, closer to the horizon, we assume him as further away, right? And that's a depth cue, a monocular depth cue of relative height. As we continue, our next monocular cue is texture gradient. This is where indistinct fine texture signals increasing distance. Okay? So these indistinct fine textures are like these much smaller boxes, these harder to distinguish areas look as if they are being sucked away or pulled back, or they're deeper, right? Whereas these larger, less fine textured pieces of the image seem like they're popping out at you. Right? The more fine texture there is in an image, the further away it seems. That's texture gradient. Okay, now we're going to move on to binocular cues. Binocular obviously means two, bi, so you need two eyes to be able to perceive depth with these cues. There are only two, okay? So if you're ever asked a question about binocular cues, you know it has to be either convergence or what we're going to get to next as retinal disparity. So that will help you narrow things down if you're ever asked about them. Convergence is when two eyes move inward towards your nose to see near objects and outward away from your nose to see far away objects. An object is perceived as closer the more your eyes turn inward. Okay, so this is convergence. Take a second and find like a pen or pencil, or you can use your finger if you need to, and you can start that pen or pencil out in front of your face. Okay, now as you bring it closer, notice, keep both eyes on it. What happens to your eyes? Eventually, you're going to become cross-eyed, right? Okay, that's convergence. The closer your eyes come together, the closer the image, your perception of the image, right? And the further it goes, your eyes are no longer crossing, and you know that the image is further away, okay? So near objects, our eyes turn inward, and that tells us how close it is to us, like this man and the fly or mosquito or whatever that may be flying towards his nose. Our second binocular cue is retinal disparity. Images from the two eyes differ. Okay? Each eye takes in its own image, right? It's its own, essentially, camera. The greater the difference between the two objects, the closer the object. Okay? So you can do the same thing with that pen or pencil. Hold it out in front of yourself, close one eye, and then switch. You should see a different image with each eye, right? The background will change a little bit. The angle from which you're perceiving it will change a little bit. If you bring it closer to your face, the image will change more drastically. Okay? That is retinal disparity, the difference in the image from eye to eye, right? And that tells us how far away something is, right? The closer the object, the bigger the difference in your retinal images. That's retinal disparity. Next couple topics. One is just our perception of movement. So we're moving on to movement. There's something called stroboscopic motion, which is our tendency to perceive motion in a series of slightly varied still images flashed in rapid succession, i.e. a flip book or a theater film, right? A movie theater is just a bunch of still images put together in a reel and it flashes through. At least it was that way potentially before digital, right? You have the candy corn man over here who looks like he's dancing because of the speed at which the flip book is flipped. That's stroboscopic motion, our perception of movement. Another perception of movement is something called the phi phenomenon. When lights flash at certain speeds, they tend to present the illusion of motion. Okay, so for example, up here, you can think of like a marquee around an old school movie theater. These yellow lights are flashing on and off, and it seems as if they're moving across the light bulbs, when in reality, they're not moving. It just makes it look like they are based on how the lights flash on and off. Okay? You can think of flashing signs or moving Christmas lights. They use this principle to create motion perception. When you're out and you go hear the music matched up with the Christmas lights and it seems like those lights are actually moving. They're not. It's just lights turning on and off, but the way that they structure it makes it look like movement. If you ever turn your phone, if you have an iPhone, on or off, this is the phi phenomenon, right? Just different parts of your phone lighting up. This is not actually moving. It just looks like it because of that phenomenon. Okay, our last topic is the size-distance relationship. This is how we organize and understand the distance and size ratio. This is the tendency to perceive an object as being the same size, regardless of whether it is close. And this is part of our perceptual constancy as well. Just like we have color constancy, we also have perceptual constancy, where we know things are supposed to stay the same, even though conditions change, right? Unless there's some type of illusion that might be tricking us. Okay? So for example, we still see and perceive the buildings in the background as tall because we know that they are far away and deep in our visual field based on cues in our environment, right? We have an understanding here that even though these buildings look small, we know they're tall, we know they're huge, we know they're large because of the size-distance relationship and perceptual constancy that we have. Now, there are some illusions that can trick our brain that have to do with size-distance relationship and can fool our perceptual constancy. So this top red bar appears bigger because of distance cues, right? This is known as the Ponzo illusion. So as these parallel lines seem to converge in the distance, it makes this red line look larger, when in reality, it's the same size as this one down here. Okay, so that's one illusion. If we manipulate the environment, we can trick our brains about size and distance. Another example we talked about earlier in our last video is the moon illusion and how the moon looks larger on the horizon than it does up in the sky. Cues to the object's distance and size at the horizon make the moon behind them seem much larger than the moon in the night sky. Right? We talked about that when we said context effects. Okay? So it's another illusion that can trick how we organize our perception and understand. Then we have the molar liar illusion. I mentioned this on our second slide. Are these vertical lines the same length? Or is one larger than the other? It would appear that this side is larger, right? But it's just the way these arrows or these other lines are displayed that tricks our brain into thinking a certain thing. That can play a trick on our perception. And finally, we have the ames room, where both girls in the room are similar height, about the same size. However, we perceive them to be of different height as they stand in the two corners of the room. So maybe some of you have been to a museum like this before, where based on the angle that you're looking at this room, you can make one person seem very small and one person seem very large. And you can do that to both of them, right? But what we've done here is we've taken away context from our brain, and we don't realize that this room is not a square. It's a different shape, and that the heights of the ceiling are different. but it tricks our brain into thinking that these people are much different sizes when they're actually not. So that's how we can learn a lot from illusions about how our brain actually processes information and how it organizes the different things that we perceive. Here's the Ames room. It's designed to give that size distance illusion. You can see it's not actually a square, right? And the way that you look at it, you have to look at it through a certain angle to make it work, right? But if you look at it from a different angle, you'd be able to tell immediately that these two girls are the same size and there's nothing different. Here's some other visual illusions. Artists are play with these visual illusions, these monocular cues very well, just so they can make it look like there's actual depth, when in reality, these are just images painted on a sidewalk or chalked out on a sidewalk. You can see an example here, this person using depth perception to make it look like this woman's just hanging out in a pool, when in reality, this is what it looks like from a different angle. Right? And these are all monocular cues, and that's why it works with a camera, because cameras are a single lens, just like a single eyeball. So they fall prey to illusions of monocular variety. When you have the chance to look at it with two eyes, like you did over here, you can tell the difference. All right, that wraps up our perceptual organization video. If you have any questions, please let me know. We'll keep working on our Perception Olympics in class and hopefully apply some of these topics. Thanks. Have a great day.